much for joining us tonight. So the purpose of our call tonight is to talk about reasonable accommodations in the workplace, which is an area that I'm really passionate about. It's something that I studied while I was in school, and now that I deal with almost on a daily basis in my job. So just to very quickly give you some perspective as far as where I'm coming from, I don't know everybody who's on the call. I probably know a handful of you, but for those who do not know me, I am a person with albinism, and I worked for about 9 years in the field of vocational rehabilitation. So I'm not an attorney. When I talk about this stuff like the Americans with Disabilities Act and your rights, self-advocacy and all that, I'm approaching it from the perspective of a rehab counselor, not from an attorney. I currently work at Hines VA Hospital for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. So in this job, I help veterans with disabilities to find jobs. I'm especially interested in self-advocacy, so that's essentially what it means to be speaking up for yourself, probably because this is something that I struggled with a lot during my younger years, and a lot of times I feel like I'm still learning what it means to be a good self-advocate, and sometimes I do still fall short. We all do. So the first step in being a good self-advocate is to know your rights and to know what the facts are. So what I intend to do here tonight, and I apologize if I start speaking too quickly, I'm really hoping to keep this to an hour, and I want to spend the first half just kind of giving you an overview and then leaving a good chunk of time for questions and answers. So I intend to give a little bit of background about Americans with Disabilities Act. I would talk a little bit about disclosure in the workplace, if, when, and how to disclose your albinism or your vision impairment in the worksite. I want to talk more about self-advocacy and what good self-advocacy looks like, and then hopefully give a few example scenarios and then open it up to questions and discussion. So usually when we talk about the term reasonable accommodations, we're considering the term in the context of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But it's worth noting that there are other federal, state, and local laws that govern these kinds of things in the workplace. But for the purposes of our discussion tonight, I wanted to just consider reasonable accommodations as they relate to the ADA. And after the teleconference, I'll direct you to that resource list that Lori mentioned earlier, and that's got a lot of other information on it. There's some really awesome organizations out there that can give you more information about this and other areas if you have more questions. So, okay, so a quick overview of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. It was signed into law in 1990, so had its big 20th anniversary a couple years ago. The requirements first took effect in 92. So what it is a major, first of its kind, federal civil rights law that protects people with disabilities from discrimination on the basis of disability in a lot of different areas. It covers employment, state and local government, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, telecommunication. All I'm going to talk about tonight is Title I, which deals with employment. So Title I of the ADA says that employers with 15 or more employees must provide qualified people with disabilities an equal opportunity to benefit from the full range of employment-related opportunities available to others. So essentially it guarantees a level playing field, protection from discrimination. It doesn't guarantee anything like special treatment for people with disabilities, just a fair shot. And it covers a lot of different areas. During the discussion tonight, it's probably going to seem like I'm focusing a lot on the actual application and hiring process, but the ADA covers everything from that to opportunities for advancement, recruitment, compensation, training, privileges, advertising, tenure, even how companies advertise their job leaves, fringe benefits, social activities, covers all kinds of stuff. There was kind of an interesting study that was done from the National Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, ADA, research project back in I think they published the study around 2005, and they looked at the lawsuits that had been filed since the ADA went into effect, and they found that less than 16% of them had to do with reasonable accommodation. The bulk of them actually had to do with unlawful termination, people who felt that they were unjustly terminated from a job because of their disability. And at that time, in 2005, a whopping 78% of those lawsuits were resolved in favor of the employer and not the person with the disability. And I'll talk in a second about what has been done since then to change that, because the spirit of the law kind of got lost in all these laws. So The Americans with Disabilities Act has a three-pronged definition when they talk about somebody having a disability, and this becomes important in a second. So it defines a disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So the major life activities there's a whole list of them, but it includes things like seeing, hearing, walking, speaking. So for the purposes of albinism, we're primarily dealing with the major life activity of seeing. The other two prongs of the definition are a history of such an impairment, which protects people with conditions like cancer that may have gone into remission, but they still have a history of such an impairment, and people who are perceived by others as having such an impairment. So again, that's something that could also come into play when we're talking about whether or not albinism may qualify as a disability. It may not necessarily be substantially limiting in this major life activity, but it certainly can be perceived by others as being such an impairment given the stigma that surrounds the condition as well. So the ADA does not go into any specifics in terms of what conditions are and aren't covered. It doesn't say this condition is always considered a disability and this one isn't, and they kind of did that on purpose. So remember this in a minute when we talk about whether albinism is a disability or not. There's not a set answer for that, and it may vary depending on the individual. It may vary on the circumstances that we're looking at. So up until a few years ago, most of the lawsuits under the ADA really dealt with the question of whether or not somebody actually qualified as having a disability. So the courts got all wrapped up in defining whether or not someone had a disability, and they weren't really getting to the issues that were being brought forth during the cases, like unlawful termination and refusal to provide reasonable accommodations and things like that. So in 2008, our friend in Congress passed the ADA Amendments Act that sort of restored the common sense definition to disability, and it sort of helped a lot to get everybody back on track and really clarify what they mean when they talk about a condition that's a disability, and prevents the courts from considering mitigating measures like eyeglasses when determining whether or not somebody is disabled, which is a big improvement. So the question then, is albinism a disability? Really depends on the functional limitations that a person may experience because of albinism. Obviously, we're all visually impaired, and a vision impairment can be substantially limiting. And as I mentioned, we could also qualify under that regarded as, that third prong of the definition, because our condition does carry some stigma. It's one that is sort of maybe noticeable, but not always understood. So it's a question that has come up a lot, and in a second I'll tell you about a case that actually went to court under the ADA involving an individual with albinism and kind of how they approached that. So I should also mention, I'm going to make an effort to keep this conversation focused specifically on albinism. So some of us may have other conditions that may qualify as a disability or other protected classes like race and gender and age and stuff like that. But for the purpose of our call, I want to keep it just focused on that. So when we get to the question part, we'll have to, just keep that in mind. So it's also worth noting that many of us in the albinism community may not readily identify as having a disability. We've grown up with this condition, we've learned to deal with it effectively in our daily lives, and we may not really feel substantially limited in our major life activities. I know I don't. So this is not a bad thing, but it's also important for us to know that however we choose to label ourselves or not to label ourselves in terms of our albinism, that laws like the ADA are here for our benefit and to give us protections and rights. So there was a whole generation of people with disabilities who spoke up and raised hell so that we could enjoy a level playing field. So call yourself whatever you want, but just remember that you have rights under the ADA when you're working, and that's what I want to talk about. So the case that I just mentioned took place in, the one involving an individual with albinism, took place in 1996. It was a case called Schmei versus AT&T, and Noah actually filed a friend of the court brief during his appeal in 2002. So this was an individual who was a long-term employee of AT&T. He applied for and received a promotion to a new position within the company as a global services manager that required him to do significantly more computer work than his previous job did. It said he had to use the computer for up to 80% of his workday. This caused him a lot of eye strain, fatigue, headaches. We could all kind of imagine what that would probably be like. Some of us spend 80+ plus% of our day looking at a computer screen. So this individual, Mr. Schmeier, requested a reassignment to a position that did not require as much reading, and he was denied that request, and then eventually, I believe he was terminated because he couldn't keep up with the demands of the job, and then filed a case under the ADA. And the courts at that time ruled in favor of AT&T as his employer because they determined that the ability to read all day is not a major life activity. He was not, although he was substantially limited in an activity, it was not a major life activity. So this is an example of how the courts just got all caught up in that definition. So the outcome of that case may have been very different had it occurred today versus in '96, now that that Amendment Act is there. So a minute ago when I was talking about how the ADA provides protections for qualified individuals with disabilities, that term qualified is also really important. To be a qualified individual with a disability, you have to meet the legitimate skill, experience, education, and requirements of a position, and be able to perform the essential functions of that job with or without an accommodation. So here's where we're getting to this discussion about when and how to request an accommodation. An essential function of your job is a fundamental job duty that you must be able to perform. A lot of times it's the reason your job exists, or it's a specialized skill that only you can do. A written job description may suffice as evidence of what your essential functions are, but usually they're not. I look at a lot of job descriptions and they're not really addressing what the essential functions of a position are. Usually this is something that is ideally determined by a job analysis. Somebody like a qualified rehab professional can do a job analysis to actually determine what the essential functions of a job are. The essential functions should be, you can think of them as the completed task, not the methods that you use in order to get the task done. So an example of that would be it may be essential that an employee travel to different sites in the community as part of his job, but it's not necessarily essential that he or she drives to those sites. The essential function is to actually visit different sites, not how you actually go about getting there, which is something that a lot of us with albinism who don't drive could probably relate. So a reasonable accommodation is a modification or adjustment to a job or the environment that enables a qualified person with a disability to participate in the application process or to perform the essential functions of his or her job or to enjoy the same benefits and privileges of employment that his or her peers enjoy at that company. So examples of reasonable accommodations are infinite. Installing adaptive technology on a computer, something like Zoom Text or JAWS or Magic. Something as simple as moving a desk to reduce glare on a computer screen. Placing Braille labels on important locations in an office building, distributing meeting handouts in large print ahead of time, waiving office procedures that prohibit employees from eating at their desks for a diabetic employee who may need to have snacks at certain time periods during the day, modifying policies to allow service dogs in the workplace, making a company website accessible to people who use adaptive technology, all are examples of reasonable accommodations. Kind of an interesting fact from our friends at the American Foundation for the Blind is that 31% of reasonable accommodations don't cost a thing. So it's a common misconception among employers that accommodations are expensive, especially when they think about hiring someone who's visually impaired. Oh my God, I'm going to have to completely reorganize my office. I'm going to have to install all new software on these computers. I'm going to have to buy new computers. Oh my God, it's going to be so expensive. But the reality of it is that almost a third of them cost $0 and are a one-time fix, like the one example I just gave about moving in a desk to reduce glare on a computer screen. That takes a few minutes and it enables somebody to do their job indefinitely. 50% of accommodations cost less than $50. So it really doesn't have to be an expensive and complicated process. And sometimes we, as our own best advocates, have to remind our employers of that. So when is an employer obligated to grant a reasonable accommodation? One of the most important things to remember here is that the law only protects individuals with known disabilities, which is why I'm going to spend so much time blabbing on about disability disclosure in a second, because if your disability isn't known and appropriately disclosed, then your protections, your rights under the law are pretty limited. So the magic words when someone's requesting a reasonable accommodation are just that, reasonable accommodation and Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. Most advocacy organizations request that you request an accommodation in writing, and that it be individualized, that you be prepared to provide a description of your disability, why the accommodation is being requested, and specifically related to how this would enable you to perform essential functions of your job. And I'm going to talk about this again in a second when I talk about self-advocacy, but it's really meant to be a collaborative process. The law was really written with the intention that employers and people with disabilities and perhaps their advocates or other service providers work together to make this happen. It's not meant to be the person with the disability standing there and dictating what the employer needs to purchase, nor should it be the employer who probably knows nothing about vision impairment telling you what's going to be best for you. It's meant to be a collaborative process. You've got to remember that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a very formal written request like I was just saying. If you're working in a close-knit environment or, somewhere where it is a little bit more laid back and you have a good relationship with supervisors or coworkers or whatever, or if the accommodation is a simple one, you can kind of just go with your gut. And if it seems easier to just start an informal request, go for it. You don't need to approach your supervisor with whom you have a good relationship with this very formal, letter written in legalese demanding accommodations. It may just be a simple discussion, and it doesn't have to be made into a big deal. But if you do encounter problems, the formal written letter is the way to go, and it's always important to have documentation, to have a paper trail just to kind of back you up and to help you out. So who pays for reasonable accommodations? Could come from a lot of different sources, and it doesn't have to be the employer. When I was working before I worked for the VA hospital, I worked for the Chicago Lighthouse for the Blind for about 5 years. And in that job, we had to do a lot of educating to employers to let them know what the options were for accommodations. Even though, as I just said, a lot of them don't have to be really costly. One of their first questions is, well, who's paying for this? So there are some tax incentives that employers can use if they're going to be paying for it out of pocket. There's also state vocational rehab programs. Here in Illinois, we have the Division of Rehab Services, but every state across the country has their own voc rehab service. They go by different names, and on the resource list that I emailed around, there was a link to a page that just had a national directory of all the state VR programs. American Foundation for the Blind also has a wonderful, wonderful searchable resource directory on their website that has links to all of them, so they can be a good resource. And other sources as well we can use here. There's also something in the law that's called an undue hardship, which was put in there to sort of protect employers from the scenario I was just describing of employees with disabilities coming in and requesting accommodations that were really unreasonable. So that clause undue hardship was put in there, and it really means that employers don't have to grant a reasonable accommodation if it's going to be a significant cost or significant disruption to the way they do business. They're still obligated to explore alternatives, but they don't necessarily have to turn their whole operation upside down to accommodate a person with a disability. Accommodations, as I was saying, don't have to be expensive or high-tech necessarily. Sometimes it's just, moving a piece of furniture, working out an arrangement with a coworker, using standard accessibility features on a computer operating system may be enough to accommodate a person with albinism on the job. We are really fortunate, those of us with albinism, to have what a good friend of mine who's a low vision optometrist calls the Cadillac of vision impairments. We can accommodate ourselves pretty well a lot of times. Our vision is stable. We've had the advantage of growing up with this vision our whole lives. A lot of us don't experience a whole lot of major changes. Some do, but we have had a chance to have many years to get comfortable with this vision, to explore what works for us and what doesn't. So we need to use that to our advantage when we're exploring solutions on the work site. So I mentioned earlier that the importance of effectively disclosing a disability in the workplace. And there's a lot of questions that go into this decision. If you're going to disclose your albinism or your vision impairment, when you're going to do it, how you're going to do it, who you're going to do it to. There are a lot of different opportunities to do that. First off, it's kind of a common misconception that a lot of people have that laws like the ADA completely prohibit employers from even asking you if you have a disability. And this is false. They can ask you. And there's a couple different scenarios where they could do it. During a job interview, if you've already expressed a need for an accommodation during the interview, for example, if they asked you to fill out an application and you asked them if they have a large print one or if they have an electronic version of it or something like that, something that may have caused them to suspect that you might have a disability, they can ask within reason. They can't, I'll tell you in a second about the stuff they can't ask, but they can inquire if you do have a disability. If you've disclosed a disability and the employer reasonably thinks that an accommodation is needed to do your job, you're already on the job and they know that you have a vision impairment and they suspect that maybe you're struggling to do a task or your performance is suffering, they can ask that. But ultimately, if your disability is obvious, again, they can ask if you do have a disability and need an accommodation. If they see you holding something up close, they may ask you, and that's their right to do that. On the job, as I said, they can ask if they suspect there's a medical explanation or a disability-related explanation for a change in performance, if they suspect that there's a direct threat. Because your disability or your vision impairment may be endangering those around you, and a direct threat that can't be remedied with a reasonable accommodation. But again, they have to use factual information when making this determination and not myths and misconceptions about what people who are visually impaired can and can't do. So let me get to, I'm going to skip over some stuff here because I've got tons and tons of information on here. I want to make sure I get to all of it. So why self-advocacy is important? Because one, as I just said, the law only protects people with known disabilities. If you can't advocate for yourself, you may be missing out on certain protections that the law affords you. It also allows you to maintain control over your albinism, over this information. It allows you to keep the focus on the good things that you bring to the table, your education, your training, your experience. It allows you to directly address questions, to confront myths and misconceptions and assumptions that an employer may have that would have otherwise gone unspoken. And it also allows you to coordinate with other resources like state folk rehab and agencies like that. But ultimately, disclosure is it's your right and it's your choice. If you choose to bring up your albinism or your vision impairment in the workplace. So what does good self-advocacy look like? First and foremost, as I said at the beginning, you have to know your rights. You can't be a good self-advocate if you don't know what your rights are. And that resource list that went around has just so much information and more information about disability rights law and advocacy and stuff like that. When you're in the workplace, when you're requesting an accommodation or even just having that initial conversation about albinism and about your vision impairment, avoid appearing overly dependent on others. So for the parents on the call, I'm sorry, but your kids with albinism are going to have to learn to speak for themselves, because appearing overly dependent on others sends exactly the wrong message that you want an employer to get. You want them to know that you're capable and that you're independent and that you're going to be able to do this job without somebody holding your hand and helping you out. So it's important that you, as the person with albinism, are comfortable and capable of speaking for yourself without having somebody else be your advocate for you, like a parent or a folk rehab counselor. Don't disclose more information about albinism than your employer needs to know. Sometimes some of us we're really comfortable with this condition. We love talking about albinism, right? I love telling people about how my parents came to this diagnosis and how they found Noah and all this and that, but it's really not relevant for my employers to know. So you have to keep it focused on work-related implications of it, and don't disclose anything more than they need to know. Don't be overly pushy about ADA or overly litigious. As I said, it's meant to be a collaborative process, and you don't want to come across as too pushy or aggressive about it. Investigate resources for purchasing and implementing accommodations ahead of time. This is great information to know before you go into a job interview or before you sit down for your first day on the job. You should know what's out there, even if you may not need it right away. It's good to know what's out there and how to connect with those resources. So start doing your research, start doing your homework. Keep in mind that a job interview might be the right time to discuss and demonstrate certain accommodations that you use, but probably not the best time to specifically request something. So For example, you may have a monocular that you use to see addresses or to see numbers on office doors or something like that when you're in an unfamiliar building. So the interviewer or the employer saw you using it, you might want to be a little bit proactive and say, oh, in case you're wondering, this is just a monocular, it's a low vision aid that I use to see things that are far away, because they might ask you about it, they might not. They might make some really weird assumptions about it and be afraid to ask. So it might be a good time to just sort of demonstrate how you are independent and capable of accommodating yourself. Recall how you've overcome barriers in the past and relate that to problems that you're facing now. Again, we are the experts on our condition, not our employers, not our voc rehab counselors. So we need to be able to say, this works for me, this doesn't. Avoid requesting accommodations that aren't needed. Don't take more than you need. There's one of my favorite lyrics from the Beatles is a line that says, all the world is birthday cake, but take a piece. So take a piece, but not too much. So take what you need, but don't get greedy and take more than you need. And as I said earlier, don't neglect the importance of a paper trail. It's always good to get things in writing and just hold on to it. So, again, how to request an accommodation. Ideally, you want to do it in writing, relate it to the essential functions of a job. Request a formal copy of your job description if possible. That's a helpful place to start. Be prepared to provide appropriate medical documentation. If you're going through a formal process to request an accommodation on the job, your employer has the right and probably the responsibility to ask you to provide some medical documentation to back it up. So a very short but concise letter from your eye doctor that says, Kelsey Thompson is a patient of mine. She has a diagnosis of albinism. Her best corrected visual acuities are boom, boom, boom. Sincerely, Dr. So-and-so, should probably be appropriate. Sometimes doctors are prepared to write longer accommodation reports, like for standardized tests and things like that might be appropriate, but sometimes a short, really focused letter that just certifies the nature of your vision impairment might be sufficient. Respect the creative process. Be flexible as much as possible without compromising on something that you need. So be open to brainstorming, I guess. You know what you need and what's going to work and what doesn't work, but you also want to be as open as you can be to other suggestions. I talked earlier about the importance of writing a letter. Okay, whenever possible, make an effort to familiarize yourself with a variety of assistive technology. A lot of us have really just embraced all of the new technology that's out there, which is awesome and has enabled those of us with albinism to do just about everything that our sighted peers can do, using computers and cell phones and GPS and all that good stuff. So it's a wonderful thing to be as familiar as you can with a lot of different types, high tech, low tech, a lot of different options so that you're not locked into using only one solution. And as I said, your supervisor on your job, your human resources representative, whoever, probably know little to nothing about vision impairments and even less about albinism, right? We all know that. So you're the expert. You got to act like it. Don't demand, be diplomatic and be knowledgeable. Make an effort to see what's out there. There are resources called the ADA Technical Assistance Centers. They go by this acronym DBTAC, and for the life of me now, I can't remember precisely what it stands for. But there are probably 5 or 6 of these offices across the country. We have one here in Chicago that serves the Great Lakes region. This is a national network of ADA Technical Assistance Centers, and they're a really cool resource because they're very skilled at not only advocating for the people with disabilities, but advocating for the employers too. They exist to sort of help bring those two sides together. So they're a good resource and skilled at really addressing the concerns of both sides and helping people to work out technical questions. So they are absolutely linked on that resource list I sent out. They're good to know. Bring in outside resources as necessary, such as state voc rehab programs, blind advocacy groups, or nonprofit organizations that you might be working with who can help you as needed. But and it's important for you as the person with the disability to sort of be the liaison to coordinate the responsibilities and the resources here. And the more people that you involve, the more challenging it's going to be to kind of coordinate everything. And you got to start practicing how to ask questions before rather than after a problem arises. So when you're dealing with, for example, your state vocational rehab counselor, you might want to start asking them early on. If you're in college, let's say, and you're preparing for for your big career after college, You might start that discussion with your counselor and ask, if I find a job, will your office be able to help me get the assistive technology that I need on the job? Can you help me get Zoom text for my office computer? Can you help me get a CCTV? Will you be covering the cost of it? What would this process look like? How is this going to look going forward? It's good to arm yourself with that information ahead of time so you're not scrambling. And what to do if you feel like your rights have been violated. Federally, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, deals with all of the Title I cases for the ADA. There's also a lot of local organizations here in Illinois. We have the Illinois Department of Human Rights. Speak to an advocate. There are organizations all over the country that are classified as protection and advocacy organizations who can provide legal assistance and guidance, free legal assistance and guidance to people with disabilities on issues related to this. So they're a nice resource to know. And so as I was saying about disability disclosure, nothing that I was just talking about in terms of the ADA and self-advocacy and requesting accommodation and all of that stuff, none of that can happen without you first coming out, so to speak, as a person with a disability, as a person with albinism. So the choice of whether or not to disclose your albinism is yours. You can decide how much to disclose, who you're going to disclose it to, how you're going to discuss albinism and your accommodation needs, learning what the hiring process might look like at a company you're applying to, learning what the essential functions of a job might be. So a couple benefits of disclosing your vision impairment are things like, for one, it begins the employer's obligation to consider accommodations that you might need. You can't get accommodations without first disclosure. It provides you with protections under the law, right? The law only protects people with known disabilities. If your disability is not known, you get zero protection. It can also give you peace of mind. I think a lot of us just feel a little bit better just kind of getting it out there and knowing that, that we've told people what the reason why we might be holding things up close, or why our eyes might shake because of nystagmus, or why we look the way we do. Sometimes it feels good just to be honest and open about it. It also gives you the opportunity to answer questions and demonstrate your positive self-perception to an employer. It gives you a chance to sort of be in control. And as a lot of us know, the flip side of that, the disadvantages of bringing up your albinism in the workplace is that, for one, you might fall victim to discrimination. We all know that even though there are certain legal protections in place, that discrimination happens, and it happens every day. So sometimes putting a condition like albinism out there may open you up to being treated negatively. Misconceptions, stereotypes, assumptions may be formed by an employer or by coworkers before you have a chance to prove yourself. Employers or coworkers may focus too much on your albinism. Have you guys ever had that happen? That's kind of annoying, right? Where I have a coworker right now, and all she wants to talk to me about is albinism. Like, she brings me pictures of animals that she found on websites and wants me to tell her if they have albinism or not. And I don't know. And so the disadvantages are you may feel like you have to sort of work harder to prove your worth on a job once you've gotten that label of, having a disability or having a vision impairment on you. You might feel like you're isolated or you've lost your privacy. Disclosing albinism is essentially you're disclosing your personal health information, your personal genetic information, and sometimes it does feel a little vulnerable to just have that out there. So the questions to ask yourself when you're deciding if you want to disclose your albinism in the workplace are, will you need an accommodation during the interview process? That's a pretty big one. If the answer to that is yes, then the disclosure's got to happen. Will you need an accommodation to perform the essential functions of the job? Are you comfortable discussing albinism with your supervisor or coworkers, or do you feel like it's none of their business? You don't want to have that discussion. Are you making any assumptions about the position and your ability to do the job? Try to think realistically. Think honestly. What's this job going to entail? Am I going to be able to keep up with these demands of the job? And if not, what accommodations are going to help me? If you don't disclose, is the employer likely to find out and sort of feel that you were being deceptive? That sometimes happens. Will the interview process involve a post-offer medical exam or eye test? Had that happen to me before when I wasn't expecting it. And the question then of when to disclose is a big one. And actually, there are a lot of different points when we're talking about the job application process itself. There are a lot of different times during that process where you may have an opportunity to advertently or inadvertently disclose your albinism. For example, it can happen on your resume. If you went to a state school for the visually impaired, Illinois School for the Visually Impaired, if that's on your resume, an employer is going to see that and probably be able to make a pretty strong assumption that you're a person with a vision impairment. I know on my resume I've got all kinds of stuff on there about my involvement with NOAA. An employer, a potential employer, is going to see that and say, National Organizations for Albinism, then I've just disclosed that I have albinism, or that I have some association with someone with albinism. So it could happen. It could happen during that phase of a job application. Do you disclose before a job interview? Do your homework ahead of time. If you apply for, let's say you find a job lead online, you submit an application, submit your resume. A week or two later, you get a call. Hi, this is Sally from Human Resources at such and such company. I'd love for you to come in for a job interview. That's so wonderful. Thank you for calling me, Sally. You might want to, at that point, ask what this interview process is going to involve. Do they have any pre-employment like testing procedures or things like that you have to go through on the day of the interview? Because if they do, you might want to know about that ahead of time so you can be prepared to, either bring something with you to the interview that will allow you to do it, or to formally request an accommodation, and just sort of do your homework and know ahead of time what it's going to entail. You have the opportunity to disclose during a job interview. I would strongly suggest you avoid doing it during such questions as tell me what do you think are your greatest weaknesses, or anything like that. You never want to give an employer an opportunity to associate albinism as something negative. If you can find a good opportunity during an interview to share a story about how maybe you encountered a barrier or a challenge because of your albinism and how you overcame that, to show your creative problem-solving skills and things like that, that would be wonderful. But you never want to use it to give an employer any reason to think of it as a negative or a liability. And the opportunity to disclose could happen after a job interview, but before a formal offer of employer is made. For example, during that point in the interview where they say, do you have any questions for me? Is there anything else about yourself that you'd like me to know about? That could be the right time to do it if you do it effectively, using some of those tips I mentioned about how to be a good self-advocate, using all that good nonverbal communication and all that good stuff. You could disclose after an offer of employment has been made. So, a week or two after the interview, you get the call. We like what you said. We'd like to bring you on. When can you start? Oh, that's so great. By the way, there's something that you should know about me, and then kind of going about it that way. Or, hey, you could wait till your first day on the job. They're getting you all settled in your cubicle, getting your computer all set up, figuring out how to log in and all that. I'd say this is probably not wise if you're going to require an accommodation that's not readily available. If you can just turn on the built-in Windows magnifier or use the Zoom features on your Mac computer and accommodate yourself, then it may be okay. But it seems like to me that a lot of times that could be perceived as you kind of springing something on them they weren't expected. You could wait until after a problem arises on the work site, just kind of do your job as best you can, accommodate yourself as you need to, and if and when a problem occurs, use that as the opportunity to bring it up, or you may choose to never bring it up at all. And as I said earlier, that ultimately it is your choice, and there is no right or wrong time to do it. Some cases it might be good to bring it up front. In some cases you might just sort of test the waters and get the vibes that, I just don't feel comfortable addressing it in that manner, and that's fine. A really quick kind of funny story from my first job outside of college. I worked for 2 years for a software company in Madison, Wisconsin, and it was my first real job after I'd been in college, so I was really nervous about it. And kind of like I described here, I went through the application process and went into the interview, and I felt like the interview went pretty well. After the interview was done, they said, well, thank you so much for coming in today. Hey, while you're here, we just have a short basic skills test we ask all of our potential employees to complete, and we do it was like a personality assessment. I think they called it a communication style profile or something like that. And they said, so come on with me, we'll take you into the other room and you can complete this test while you're here this same day. So I said, I was thinking to myself, oh my God, here we go. So they took me into this other room. It was really poorly lit, and they gave me this very small print paper assessment thing that I had to fill out by pencil, and then they sent me down at a computer to do this other test, and the screen was a really old computer, and the screen was really small, and the resolution was terrible, and I struggled to get through it all, but miraculously I did. And so that was an example of something where if I had just asked a few questions ahead of time before coming into the interview, I maybe could have been a little bit better prepared for it. But I got through it, ended up getting the job. And I decided that I really wasn't going to need a heck of a lot of accommodations to do this job. It was mostly on the computer, and I do fine on the computer just using a little built-in magnifier and whatnot. So, and adjusting the display settings and stuff. So I didn't make a big formal production of telling my supervisor or my HR rep that I had a disability. So I was on the job for about a year. It was going fine. I was keeping up with everything, no problem. And a new guy, I was part of a very small team, one of the smallest departments within the company. There were, I think, like 6 or 7 people in my little department. And then about a year into my time there, a new guy started in our department. And he came on. He was real nice. He was very eager, ready to go, really energetic. And on like his first day or two there, he let us all know. He said, during our staff meeting, he said, I just want all you guys to know that I'm visually impaired. I use certain accommodations on the computer and blah, blah, blah. And everybody was really cool. He said, oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah, no problem. Very cool. Thanks for letting us know. And I had this really weird feeling of like, hey guys, I'm visually impaired too. I just never done anything about it before. So it was kind of bizarre that in this big company that I worked for, of all the departments this guy could have been placed in, he ended up getting sent to mine just very coincidentally, and then he also happened to have a severe vision impairment, and he chose a very different route to disclose it, and it worked out well for him. So that was a funny learning experience for me. Again, just a few pointers about how to disclose, how to be a good self-advocate, positive nonverbal communication, carrying yourself and speaking in such a way that conveys confidence but isn't overly aggressive or assertive. Making eye contact as best as we're able to. And conveying confidence in your posture and things like that. Focusing on the job-related implications of your vision impairment, always important. Don't be apologetic. Which I still sometimes have a tendency to do. State your accommodation needs and the benefits that they're going to allow you, not just the benefits, but how they're going to enable you to perform your job efficiently and effectively. And as I mentioned several times before, be prepared, do your research, do your homework up front so that when you do disclose, you're prepared for it. Offer solutions, offer outside resources, clarify responsibilities, tell your employer, tell you what, here's what I'm going to do. Here's what you can do to best help me. Offer supporting documentation if necessary. Be prepared with a vision report in case you're asked for it so that you don't have to scramble and get an appointment to see your eye doctor and all that stuff. Use your own words. In one of these other presentations I often do for NOAA, I suggest that people come up with your elevator story for albinism. That is the explanation you can give to somebody in the time it takes to ride in an elevator, how you can explain to that person what albinism is, what it's all about. And you put it in your own words in a way that you're comfortable explaining it. Focus on your abilities and your qualifications, as I said. Make sure the employer sees the positive stuff. I'm going to skip over this stuff here. Okay, so I guess at this point I had a few example scenarios, but I kind of already used them for the most part in some of these other discussions. So I guess at this point I will open it up to questions or discussion if folks have anything that needs clarification or if you want to share any questions.
Kelsey, I have a question. All right, now this is going back a long time, back to the 60s when I was hired to teach. All right, I was told that for anyone who had a disability that the district hired, they would get an extra reimbursement per person. Is that true? In other words, the federal government will give employers reimbursements for hiring a person with a disability?
The short answer is yes. There are tax incentives out there that employers can take advantage of. There's really specific things that qualify for them. It's not just hiring, any person with a disability that make you eligible for them. But yeah, the short answer of it is that, yeah, there's a couple tax credits that are out there that employers can and do use if they hire people with disabilities.
Yeah, because that would seem like, a good incentive to me to hire you.
Absolutely, and I know that there are some that are very specific for to help employers to pay for reasonable accommodations, like I said, so that if you do have an accommodation that is really costly, that sometimes employers can finagle for tax purposes so that they can get some reimbursement for that and write it off.
my CCTV, my monocular, any aids that I had were paid for through the rehab. The district didn't have to pay at all.
Yeah, and a lot of states, that varies from state to state. But yeah, a lot of states you can get some fantastic support from your state stroke rehab agency. If there's an expense that's going to allow you to find or maintain a job, a lot of times they'll put up the cost for that so that you can keep the job or get the tools that you need in order to get a job.
Kelsey, I had a question. My name is Joan, and I'm in California. I'm an admin assistant, 58, and I've been with this company since '92. And recently, 2 years ago, we had a new admin come in. And my biggest fear, actually, is that I'm just slower. I do data entry and I complete charts, and I know my job very well. Well, there's been tons of changes in terms of the software. I mean, it just changes the name of the game. And I'm just worried that my productivity level is not what it ought to be because there's just no way around it. I mean, it doesn't make much sense for me to be in a data entry position, but that's what happened.
Do you sorry, go ahead.
So I just don't know how this all works together. I mean, I recently did get a visual assessment at work from a local low vision optometrist office, and they've come up with a few ideas. I don't think I'm quite at the point of needing a CCTV or anything like that, but I'm just worried about my speed and my productivity, and I don't know how that fits in all of this, if at all.
So have you gotten any? Has your supervisor or your employer given you any feedback or any negative feedback about the productivity? Have they mentioned or hinted that is an issue? Are you kept to daily quotas or anything like that with your experience?
Well, not really. In the last evaluation I had, the performance expectation was most of them were really good, but it was sort of meets the expected performance.
Okay.
And there's just been all this change, and we are behind, but that's a function of also the fact that we've had tons of referrals and charts and admits, and there's been all this change, which creates, a slowing down in terms of new people doing work that I have to, work with.
Yeah. And actually, any time of transition like that in a job, whether it's a new supervisor coming on board or rolling out a new software program that you have to use, or reconfiguring of your job, starting a new position in the same company, whatever, any time of transition like that it can be really stressful, especially for those of us that are visually impaired. Changes like that can really shake things up for us, where we kind of get our set routine, our set methods for doing things, and when something, even if it's something minor, gets changed like that, it may take us a while to adapt and figure out a new way to do things or a new way to work within a system. So I think first off that just making sure that you're communicating with your supervisor and whoever's doing your evaluations, they're just keeping the lines of communication really open and honest. And it sounds like your evaluations have still remained generally positive, which is good. You want to make sure that they have opportunities to give you feedback. If this is going to be if your slower productivity is an issue, you want them to let you know about it ahead of time, so that you have an opportunity to bring in some accommodation ideas that may be able to help address it. The last thing you want is to be caught off guard by an evaluation that says, oh yeah, you've been failing to meet our expectations for the last year and nobody said anything. So I think that by you kind of being a little bit proactive and making sure you're getting some feedback, you're getting an appropriate amount of feedback from them to know that you're doing your job okay is good. And then I said a couple times earlier, I think that it should be a creative process. So you had a vision assessment, which is good, and that's going to give you some really practical information to work with. And then, take that back to the work site and maybe work with your supervisor and possibly the low vision optometrist, and maybe a voc rehab counselor from your state if they're open to working with you as a job retention case. Just sort of do some brainstorming, work out a few solutions and see if there are some changes that they can make or some technology they can bring in that might help to increase your productivity. There's a lot of different ways that they might be able to do it. And voc rehab counselors by training, we're supposed to be creative people. We look at people with any type of disability and have to be able to say, I believe this person can work, and here's how I think I can empower this person to do their job. So that might be another good resource to bring in if your state is willing to give you some support with that in order to help you to keep your job.
Would you suggest just having a conversation with my manager and just saying my concerns about it? Just because part of the thing is my fellow admin, is younger than me about 20 years.
Yeah.
How fast she is! I'm going, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And I don't know. It's a little tricky sometimes.
Sure. Yeah.
We have way more spreadsheets than we used to, and and I'm doing it all, but I'm just, sometimes tracking on them is hard when they're big, and it just, I don't know. It's hard.
Yeah, but I think that communication is important. Yeah, I think bringing it to your supervisor and just making sure that he or she has an opportunity to communicate with you and vice versa, I think is important, and it may be something that they're reluctant to bring up, or it may not be as big of an issue as you think, or whatever. But you won't know unless you really make an effort to communicate it to them and ask for feedback. And if there's a problem, like I said, work with them to find some solutions that'll work, and be open to to trying something new and seeing if it works.
Yeah. As on a related vein, I always have the email police after me.
Oh,
I really do find it's just challenging. There's so many emails, and I'm always, my size that I'm using up is always too much. And can I ask for more size?
That's a problem I can relate to all too well. At the VA, we call that being an email jail, where your email box gets loaded up too much and you can't receive or send you messages. I'm in email jail like every other day. Yeah, if you can make a good case for why you need, then that's a pretty simple accommodation. Your IT people can make that change. If you can make a good case for why you need some extra space, that should be a reasonable request, I would think.
I always feel like I'm just, it's just scrounging to keep up with it and keep.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
And it just, it's just the reality is I'm probably a little slower at reading it than your average bear.
Right, and that's the case you make is that it just may take you longer to get through them and to sort through and prioritize the ones that are important and to get rid of the garbage. So yeah, that seems more than reasonable to ask.
A reasonable request, you think?
Yeah, I would say so.
We've got about 5 minutes, Kelsey.
Okay, other questions, comments?
Kelsey, may I make a comment?
Sure.
Yeah, my situation is I've been in a government department for 30 years, and my building manager and my supervisor have been less than complimenting, put it that way. They're Aboriginal, okay? And now finally we have a new district manager and is willing to, I think, purchase an architect for me.
Okay.
When I talk to my building manager, he goes, well, if you get an accommodation, everybody has to be able to use it, which is not true.
Yeah, right now.
So, I'm kind of happy the district manager is open to suggestions. I guess that's about it.
Okay. Yeah, that's a funny reaction that if we give you an accommodation, everybody needs to be able to use it. That made me smile. So, but yeah, I think that it's good that the new manager seems to be a little bit more open to to getting you the technology that you need in order to do your job, and it may take a little bit of of advocating, of conflict resolution to work with that other the other manager or supervisor to make sure that they understand what this is for, that this isn't like giving you special treatment or
Not like show and tell.
Exactly. This isn't, a perk or a special thing that they're giving you. This is something that's allowing you, a level playing field.
Yeah.
And I don't know why your colleagues would want to use CCTV anyway.
Like, I mean, it's with a prescription. How is anybody else going to use it?
Yeah, right. So yeah, maybe the solution there is just to say, okay, yeah, that's no problem. Other people can use it if they want, knowing full well that nobody's going to even know how to use it, let alone, have it work for them.
Although I have a funny story in that I work at a department store, and my little pocket magnifier is sometimes in high demand trying to read really small numbers because not just the UPC number that you have on your price tag is also usually on the back of a tag inside of the clothing, but it's very small. So if the tags come off the clothes and we want to find the price, we've got to read that number. And people say, Joni, where's your magnifier? I need to read these numbers. I'm like, go buy your own. Actually, I gave somebody one of my cast-off ones that I didn't like just because they needed it almost as much as I did.
Actually, just today I had a coworker ask me where I got my magnifier because I was using it during a staff meeting to look at a PowerPoint presentation, and she says, God, I could really use one of those. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I remember when I got my monocular in school. Of course, naturally, they're little kids and they're all interested, and I told them it was my magic spyglass, and I said, I'll let you all take a look one at a time, and and I did. And then once they had their curiosity satisfied, they forgot about it.
Mhm. Mhm. It's funny how sometimes we, in our minds, sort of have a tendency to make things out to be a bigger deal than they actually are. Once you just, put it out there, address a few questions, and get people comfortable with it, they really do just, kind of forget about it and treat you just like they would anybody else. Mm-hmm. I've had the same thing happen to me many times. Where I feel like after the fact, like, what was I even worrying about? That was so not a big deal.
One thing that worked for me, because I was dealing with a lot of papers, like from the district and inter-school papers, and they're all the same print. And even with my monocular, just like reading them, trying fast, I would get very nervous. So I put them in a folder and I color dotted them so that I knew like what it was about, like red was for math papers or green was for, like another subject area, blue was for the PTA papers. And I mean, that color dotting really worked for me, and it took a lot of stress off me.
That's a great example, and I mean that's a creative but a really simple solution, and that really increased your efficiency and the ease with which you were able to navigate your stuff, and yeah, that's the kind of thing that a lot of us we can figure out little solutions like that just on our own. We've had the luxury of living with this vision impairment our whole lives. We can work to find little things like that might make a really big difference.
Because the most I noticed was stress, like stress that I would put myself under because I didn't see fast.
Mhm. Yeah, I was going to make a comment from California. She was struggling and questioning about whether or not to talk to a manager. I was just going to suggest that maybe you sort of kind of in your mind develop your own mantra. Maybe see yourself as a little slower or working slower, but maybe you're slow but efficient. And if you can just stress how efficient you are, then the speed, of your might not be
such a focus.
Mhm. Right. Keep them just maybe on like advocacy or something else that's invaluable that you're bringing to this department. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Thank you.
And I mean, some accommodations, like you said, Kelsey, are things that aren't monetary, are simple. One time, when I was hired for my job, I work at Kohl's, of course, I was hired in a position that didn't require me to run a cash register. I've run cash registers in the past when I was younger. It sometimes led to interesting situations with customers who thought I was shortchanging them and questioning their signatures and things, which I wasn't. But I didn't purposely go for a job without that. It was just the position I applied for. Well, after a couple of years, then they changed the job descriptions and were supposed to back up, people on the registers and stuff. But they basically exempted me from that in lieu of doing other things, because some of the registers are by doors with way too much glare on them, and I can't see them for the life of me, the screens, because the sun's right on them. And there's no way to move them somewhere else. So they just said, okay, you don't have to run the register, but here's, in lieu of that, you can help if it's super busy, the line's long. You can come and bag the purchases. You can, run and find the prices that are missing. You can carry things out to somebody's car, different tasks. And it was a trade-off, and I'm okay with it.
Right, and that's an accommodation that didn't cost them a thing. It was just doing a little bit of rearranging of the job assignments, and it worked out pretty well.
Necessarily, it just kind of how it kind of they knew that I couldn't see it. It's just like, well, does this work? I'm like, yeah, sounds like a good plan to me. And I've been there 15 years. And once in a while,
so it works. That's good. That's a really good example.
Well, once in a while we have to program a new manager, because we get at least one new one every year, sometimes 3 or 4. They're in and out the door pretty fast, and some of them don't quite get it and need to be programmed a little bit. But for the most part,
you got to train them.
You got to train some of them. Yeah.
For the woman from California who was, concerned with her timing, and she mentioned about spreadsheets, like so much more detail being put on them. I mean, if you took the spreadsheet yourself and went over it, could you arrange it yourself so that maybe there would be more important things that you would look at first? In other words, be able to give it a quick browse over, and other things on the spreadsheet that might not be as vital that you wouldn't need to look at? So that might increase your speed?
That's a good idea. I do have some control over what is where, and the biggest problem I have is sometimes there's just so much data that you lose track of what line you're on. Because you have to move. If you want to look at speed, there's a lot, and it just doesn't.
Yeah, and the key is to also give yourself permission to take the extra time that you need. Just like if you were younger and you had to take a standardized test and legally you're allowed to have extra time, the same principle applies on the job. Maybe to get the task done, you just need extra time.
Yeah, well, I can definitely do it. It's just that, I don't think I'm doing it as fast as my coworker.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't. Don't spend a lot of time comparing yourself to people that are 20 years younger, because we really get ourselves into a lot of trouble doing that.
Yeah, for sure.
Right, and I think as long as you're getting some good feedback from your supervisor, they're not alerting you that this is a major issue. I think that making your effort, it sounds like you've already made a really sincere effort to address that. And if they do still think that more improvement needs to be done, then you can start looking at some more creative solutions. Like Margaret Murray was saying, maybe finding some different ways to format or color code the information that you're looking at so that you can scan across it a little bit more, more efficiently.
I even brought in a kitchen timer to time tasks to make you more aware of, the clock is going.
So that kind of has the negative effect, doesn't it? When you're for being kind, then you sort of I know I'm that way.
Yeah, I even heard someone say before that if they knew they were being kind, it increased their nystagmus.
Oh. Well, I appreciate everybody. This has been fantastic, hearing all this and everybody's comments and questions. This is great. Thank you.
I'm glad. I'm
Kelsey,
glad you came.
So much. Thank you, Kelsey. You did a fabulous job as always.
Yes, Kelsey, you sure did.
Thanks. This is something I love talking about, and this is good discussion, too. I really appreciate you guys' contributions.
Thank you, everybody.
Something we all need a refresher on once in a while.
Just out of curiosity, how many people do we have on the call?
We had about a dozen.
Okay.
So I'll send out a short, a link to just a very short survey if folks will take a moment just to answer that. It helps us with the feedback for future programs. And again, thank you, Kelsey, for spending the time with us this evening. Yeah, thanks, guys. My email address is on that resource list, too. If anybody wants to shoot me an email or has other questions, please feel free.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
All right, bye. Good night.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.